Welcome to Liberty Unlocked. I'm your host, Don Watkins. So today I'm really excited. I'm going to be talking in the podcast to one of my best friends, Edmonsond, about his journey from somebody who considered himself on the left to somebody who's an advocate for laissez-faire capitalism. And the number one takeaway that I want to encourage people to have is it is super common in my experience that people think, oh, like the people who are going to be interested in freedom are conservatives or people who are, quote, on the right. And I found that this is not necessarily true, particularly if you're talking about very intellectual people and very philosophic people. And one thing to remember is that the reasons people are attracted to a certain set of ideas is often in rebellion against the flaws on the other side. So if you believe, as I do, that like traditional conservatives or that just Republicans as a group have major flaws in their attitude towards science, in their attitude towards freedom, in their attitude towards, sexuality, in their attitudes towards race, or their beliefs about these issues, then it shouldn't be a surprise if really good people are attracted to movements that oppose them. And so I actually think, as a general rule, this idea of like, we're going to look for pre-selected categories of people who are, quote, persuadable is totally wrong. Every human being, insofar as they're seeking knowledge and seeking to understand the world, is potentially persuadable. And what often is going on is that we're using our failures as persuaders as excuses for only going after people who are, quote, 99%, of the way there. And so rather than focus on like, how do I target like this really promising group, instead think, how do I speak to the concerns of thoughtful individuals? And I think that's going to get you a lot further down the road. And then as you're thinking about like the responses you're getting, be in the assumption that if you're not being successful, it's your failing. And that should be something really exciting and empowering, because if it's not your fault that you're failing, then success is out of your control. And you never want to have success out of your control. You always want to be able to do things to improve your ability to communicate and persuade. Quick word about Adam. Besides being one of my best friends, he's also an employee at the Ayn Rand Institute. But I want to highlight, and he wants me to stress, like, he's not a spokesman for the Institute, so Adam is here speaking only for himself. Few final words. If you want to support the podcast, the best thing you can do is sign up for my newsletter at donswriting.com, and you'll get access to my free email course, Persuasion Bootcamp, which just has been, I've gotten a ton of great feedback on it. It's some of my best advice condensed into a week of emails. So sign up for that, definitely. If you want to support the show financially, every dollar that we get that goes towards the podcast is used to promote the podcast and bring it to a wider audience. You can find that below the video, the link, or you can just go to libertyunlocked.com. So I hope you enjoy it, and I will talk to you next time.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for doing this, Adam. So I met you in, what year was it? Do you remember? 2014?
2011.
Was it?
2011 in Fort Lauderdale.
Yeah, in Florida. And we were at a conference together, and I saw there's this group of people surrounding our mutual friend Onkar Ghate from the Ayn Rand Institute and asking him questions. And I just was like to stand around and always hear what Onkar has to say, because I think he's a really insightful person. But then there's like this kid asking these really good questions. I don't even remember what they were, but what I remember thinking was, oh man, I've never heard somebody like make this point or use that kind of formulation, which if you're around young people interested in objectivism, this is an Ayn Rand Institute conference. That's very rare. Like, it's just most people are kind of coming from, they're saying things you've heard before, put it that way. And anyway, my antenna went up, and so I tracked you down at some point, and I remember we just talked for a few hours. And one of the things that was fascinating to me is I was like, all right, maybe this kid was like me, because I think you were 19 at the time, or 20?
21.
21. Oh, that's right. It was 19 when you discovered Ayn Rand.
Yeah, and then actually I was in the Objectivist Academic Center course after that in like 2010, and you were grading some of my writing, I remember.
Oh God, I would love to go see that again. But in any case, one of the things that intrigued me was the fact that you had only been studying the philosophy for 2 years at that point. But B, like you had a really interesting story in that, like I discovered Ayn Rand basically not knowing anything about anything. So I got like my first exposure to politics was the politics of laissez-faire capitalism. Um, and you, on the other hand, started from like a very different place intellectually. So, I mean, we can focus on politics, but I'm interested in kind of the whole worldview you sort of started with, and then we can delve into what changed.
Hmm. Yeah, I think so. For me, politics became a topic probably in middle school, and it would have been when at the period of time when a lot of kids are reading like Night by Elie Wiesel and studying the Holocaust, starting to study the Holocaust, and that was real. I mean, that was the framework through which I began to think about issues of the relationship between the individual and society, and that that carried into high school. I was always interested in these kinds of 1984, Brave New World, kind of dystopian novels, as they're called, and it was it was something that, to me, the way it stood in my mind was that this is evil, that the individual being crushed by society is evil, and that's what I'm against. But I had no idea how to translate that into any other ideas or practical sense of what my politics should be like. And at the time, that put me in a fairly left-leaning camp.
Well, that's interesting. So you say that like it's self-evident, but why would that have put you in the left-leaning camp? Because I think this is really important. I think there's a tendency, because a lot of people who are even very like pro-capitalism now tend to associate themselves like, well, clearly, like we all know the left is wrong, and it's only a question of, is it conservative, is it libertarian, is it anarchist, is it objectivist? And I actually think there's like there's really plausible reasons why somebody would be attracted to what's conventionally called the left. So why for you is that really resonant at that point?
I think, to me, part of it was the fusion of cultural issues into what you could look out and see on the left versus the right at the time. And if you were thinking about the side that was more interested in inquiry and thinking and intellectual issues, it was generally people on the left. Those happened to be the teachers. So, of course, the framing of world events and so on was influenced by people who were generally on the left. There was the influence of music. I had a period, when I was like 13 years old, 14, of listening to a lot of punk rock. And, if you read the lyrics, listen to the interviews with the musicians and so on, it's all, it's the standard stuff that they got from reading Howard Zinn in high school, like about imperialism and capitalism and all of this. And I think that, but there was something that people on the left seemed to be the ones that took morality seriously, and that would be willing to carry out even its inconvenient consequences, even inconvenient to themselves. And to me, people on the right, I didn't know very many of them. For example, you didn't. I mean, I had no exposure to conservatives or people like that. But if you're thinking about somebody that is a traditionalist, probably religious, and so on, that to me is the opposite of thinking and individualism. And it was more of a sort of a matter of clustering. If you think about like how these things kind of hang together, it's not that there are any kind of clear principles in the way that most people think about politics. I think it's just a matter of you associate these kind of tendencies and values with these groups of people, and then you begin to pay attention to those people, be influenced by their framing of events, current and historical, and then you start to get ideas that are sort of imbibed that way.
Yeah, and I think often it's much more kind of disaffiliation, right? Like it's, well, I don't want to be like those people. And so I'm kind of attracted, to the other side. So it's like the kind, yeah, you grew up in, I always forget which state,
Missouri, but
Missouri.
Kansas City area. So
Yeah, and I mean there can be a tendency, particularly if you have like really really religious people in your area, to say, well, I don't want anything to do with that. So here's the opposite team, and until you can reach a really difficult place that most people don't, which is seeing a set of intellectual issues instead of a set of teams, like you're never going to get anywhere. And then even once you see the set of intellectual issues, they're put together in these packages that it's hard to separate out. So to be, for instance, pro science and pro market is a very unusual combination.
yeah, and I think too the background at the time was that George Bush was president. This was a couple years after 9/11 when I started forming political views, and so the sort of unity that occurred around 9/11 had sort of worn off, and you had people with the "Not My President" bumper stickers and all of that kind of thing, and the war, people protesting the war, and then you have just a period where politics also becomes more prominent, in the culture when we're entering into a war that a lot of people are against. And I think too, I had a big part of this is influenced by teachers. Everybody has teachers, I think, that sort of stood out for them. And I had a teacher who was just a powerhouse intellectual. She was an English teacher, but she also taught a class called Theory of Knowledge, which was part of the International Baccalaureate curriculum. And I wasn't enrolled in the class, but I was allowed to audit it. And because it didn't fit into the schedule, it met at 6 a.m. So I came and audited that class every I think it was every other morning at 6 a.m. And so she was like, whoa, what's this kid? Like, he's not even getting a grade for this class. And she gave me Sophie's World. She gave me, a list of book recommendations. And her favorite philosopher, she called him a philosopher, I'm not quite sure if I'd put him there, but is Noam Chomsky.
That's so, I was literally going to guess that. I don't think you might have told me that though, but what issues were the most prominent in your mind during that period? Like what, so we talked about kind of a general orientation and worldview, but like, what were the kind of live things in your mind that you were most thinking about?
I think, to me, politics then was almost entirely fixed on questions of, or answers to this painted scenario of, we live in this world where people are starving and dying of poverty and whatever else. And of course, the people who are thinking primarily about that sort of thing in politics are also thinking about animal rights and abuses in factory farms and like all this, just everything's a horror show. And how do we relieve suffering? And so it's relieving suffering, but then it's also, how do we create a system where, the people who are not the savvy business types are not going to be taken advantage of and starve? And so it was in a way, it's this, you can start from a point of being kind of benevolent and caring about the plight of people in general, and in particular, but I mean, actually seeing these stories about people like who are poor, and you drive through a big city and you just see this like blight, and you're like, what is going on here? And the explanation everyone gives you is, well, this is capitalism. Inherent in capitalism is that, the poor are going to be exploited, and people justify it by saying that, the way like capitalism is the most effective producer of wealth. And so we have to tolerate the fact that the wealth is being absorbed by the people who are generating it, or companies are generating it at the top. And, down at the bottom, basically these people are kind of in a position of having to make themselves useful to people. in order to survive, and they have to spend all of their time on bare survival, aren't able to explore their artistic creativity, aren't able, and then these anarchists and these socialists and these sort of libertarian socialists like Chomsky, if you can combine those ideas, are going on about, hey, we can create a world in which there isn't all this destruction of wealth through competition. It's we have this organized way of producing wealth, and that people can work. We can work fewer hours. People can all explore their own interests and be more creative rather than turning a crank at a factory. And that if we can reorganize society so that we produce enough wealth, the problem is it's just being distributed in a way that it can't actually be used by the majority of people. And so if we could just create that system, then we can actually have this kind of world where people are no longer committing crimes because they're not desperate. They're no longer engaging in violence and hatred and so on because they don't have these pressures coming onto them from all sides. So there's sort of this utopian vision, which Marx, I think, got started on the idea that it's once you have socialism in some sense, then eventually you get to a point where people maybe only have to work 2-3 hours a day, and then the rest of the time we're all just doing normal human things rather than focusing entirely on our survival.
How would you have explained why people disagreed with that perspective in those days?
I would have thought, and I think would have been told, that they disagree with that maybe disingenuously, or that they had the wool pulled over their eyes by people who have an incentive to be a part of the system that was a problem. And so it would be either they were in a position to benefit from that system, hoped to be in a beneficial position in that system, or had been subjected to propaganda. And this is at a time when I thought that it was crazy to think that the news outlets were all left-leaning. Chomsky and people like him think they're like center-right. So.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most ongoing, long-standing questions on the left is, I mean, there's all kinds of books that are written in it, popular books and things, but there's this long-standing question of like, well, why is it that poor people don't vote their economic interests? So they take it for granted that their economic interest is to overthrow capitalism and have like a bunch of handouts, or even to get rid of the capitalist system altogether. And then it just becomes this mystery of why they don't accept it. And so it was interesting for me to hear in your account, like, it's not just the people benefiting from it, but the people hoping to benefit from it. In other words, there's a whole narrative that can explain what what obviously can't be explained, that people are just convinced that freedom is good. Not that the left would put it as freedom, but like that would think a capitalist system is good. When's the first thing that you well, let me back up. Do you recall at this time, like, how certain that framework felt for you, or were there things that made you uneasy, or questions that were kind of bothering you, even if it was small in those days?
Well, the thing that really was the pebble in my shoe was the clear implications in implementation, that you would have to use force against people to extract the wealth and redistribute it and so on. And it's sort of something that's hand waved away. It's not something that people look at. It's sort of, don't watch how the sausage is being made. They don't want to think about, okay, concretely, I begin a business, and then what? Like, it's producing wealth. Then someone comes and says, the IRS or whoever comes and says, okay, we're going to take some of that and give it to all the people who need it. And it doesn't matter if you're okay with that or not. So what happens next? A gun. And it's never presented to you as that's what you're for on that side. So it's, the idea there is, well, why would you be against, giving what if everybody is contributing to the system, if all the businesses are handing either the money over or some huge amount of taxes or whatever over to the state for redistribution, like, why don't you want to do that? And if you don't want to do that, there's something wrong with you. You don't want this system that we're talking about, this utopia where everyone can be happy. And if you don't want that, well, then, maybe I don't feel too badly about this, because if you want the right not to be moral, I'm not interested in protecting your right not to be moral. But when you think through it and you think about the force involved, you think about the collectivism involved. I mean, it really becomes what it would actually take to pull that world into existence is horrific, as we've always seen. And it was that tension that was like very clear to me, and became clearer to me. It's like, okay, I can be attracted by the painted vision that you're giving me, but no way I see of getting there is acceptable. And that's actually when I picked up Chomsky's book, Libertarian Socialism, because it was, how do I combine this world that solves all these problems, which I firmly, believed had been caused by capitalism inherently? How do I reconcile that with my long-standing kind of deep view that what I was seeing in these kind of dystopian novels and in reading about the Holocaust, which I studied in very detail, how do I reconcile it with the recognition that relationship between the individual and society is evil? And so it was like, is there a libertarian or a kind of, and that camp is also tied in with anarchism and so on. And people would say, well, we've only ever tried state socialism, where you have this concentration of top-down power, right, and you have totalitarian politics. Why can't there be some sort of a anarchist version of like a bottom-up, grassroots kind of form of socialism that doesn't have all of these nasty ramifications? And just wrestling with these contradictions was actually painful. Like, it felt like I had two sides in my mind in my freshman year of college, and that they were pressing against each other in a way that was intolerable. And that's actually right at the time that I discovered Ayn Rand.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that's interesting there, but one thing I think is really is worth highlighting is, one of the things I talk a lot about when I teach persuasive communication is the issue that, people have these frameworks that consists of methods, assumptions, and goals. And when it comes to methods, which is like, how are we automatically going about thinking about issues? If you think about, there's a certain common framework among opponents of freedom, and one of them is, or one part of the method is, not distinguishing between or hiding the coercive elements in their coercive policies, right? And so it's not that they come out and say, all right, look, what we advocate is coercing people, expropriating their businesses, and doing all of these things, and we think it's justified for X reason. If you push back against them, they'll come up with a justification, but they don't, like, that's, as you said, it's like tucked away and not brought to the forefront, because that's not what's important. What's important is this kind of vague, out of context vision of, wouldn't it be great if we all, had everything we wanted and nobody suffered and nobody, took any more than they needed. And even just that sheer fact of getting on the table, like, you were able to internally recognize that that's something important to think about. But if, like, if that was more actively just put on the table of, well, how do we make sense of this and how should we evaluate it? It would be harder, I think, for more people to hold that view, at least hold that view without more skepticism or concern.
Yeah, and I think if you're wanting to influence or persuade someone one-on-one, it's very important to force them to look at the ramifications concretely of the policies that they're advocating. And the more they have to look at that side of it, the more they become uncomfortable, at least, and open to new ideas. And I was begging for new ideas, when I realized that. And most of the time, we're trying to persuade people who aren't begging for new ideas. So if you can get someone to be in the market, so to speak, for a new worldview, then you're already off to a very good start. And I think the my experience was that reading Ayn Rand was just a relief of the tension from that contradiction. It
Yeah,
was
so
like, oh wow, we can have it all, because people understand that many things have trade-offs that are really unattractive. Like, we have to do things that most people would be very uncomfortable doing in order to eat meat. And most people judge at the end of the day that it's still worth doing. But they would really say, wow, it's a damn shame that the world has to be that way. But, at the end of the day, my ultimate value is my own life, and I'm going to eat meat. And that was the experience of politics. It wasn't cavalier, like you have to crack a few eggs, break a few eggs to make an omelet. It's really a damn shame that we have to have this coercion, but we can't see a way around it if we want the world that we're talking about. And to me then, and this is actually the way that I approached talking about objectivism to most people later, most of whom were all on the left, anyone that I was successful with anyway, it was actually, you don't have to have this hideous trade-off. There's a way in where it all fits together, and it's actually in everyone's interest.
well, I want to come back to that, because that was the other thing, is like once your views changed, you had a lot of success with other people, certainly more than most people have, about persuading people of very controversial, very fundamental ideas. But I wonder if you can kind of just summarize, sort of, almost journalistically, like, so, what did the process look like of, you were wrestling with these ideas, you encounter Ayn Rand, and like, how does that play out?
It was so one element of this that should be painted out a lot is the view that morality is important. And that, I think, I always had, and I think a lot of people on the left do. And that's why they will go to, I think they'll go to the end of the world in certain ways to make sure that they are advocating for the society that's right, whether or not it's convenient, wealthy. It's morality. People who have big focus on morality as important are, I think, the ones who are led into most ideologies, and for the reason that they want to create the world that's in line with the morality. And I think when I discovered Ayn Rand, part of it was the way she discussed morality was the way that I'd only ever seen people on the left discussing morality.
In what sense? Taking it seriously, you mean?
Taking it very seriously and seeming to genuinely be fueled by it. So her views were driven by a morality. The morality wasn't brought in afterward and with some sort of rationalization of what it's, the Jesus wants you to have an SUV kind of conservative capitalism that you saw on the other side, from my perspective, was hypocritical. It was, well, we want the wealth, and we're going to rationalize it morally somehow. And the opposite of that mentality is, okay, we're going to find out what's moral, and then we're going to do it come hell or high water. And the latter seemed to be more of what Ayn Rand was like when I found her. and there was no I had almost no struggle with it. It just, when I read, I started with the virtue of selfishness, and it was because I had no interest particularly in political issues framed as political issues. I was interested in politics as morality, as an application of morality. And it was, when I read The Virtue of Selfishness, it just felt like, a hand in a glove, just perfect.
I mean, that's so interesting, but it's also astonishing, right? Because at the level of content, so I definitely can see you resonating in somebody who is sympathetic, or even a committed, committed to the left, resonating with her, like the seriousness of morality. But at least it would seem on the surface that at the level of content, what she's regarding as moral is so diametrically opposed to what everybody else regards. And to the extent that anybody in the culture sees similarities between Ayn Rand, it's usually Christians who say, oh, that's kind of like our ethics, right? Like the prosperity, Christianity you said. It's not the people who are saying, no, ethics is really concerned with a, fair, equitable world. So can you how much can you articulate why the content was not a barrier in the way that one might expect it to be?
I get it might just be a form of being very scrupulous and listening to one idea at a time and being willing to judge it. But I think at the same time, it wasn't too foreign to me as a framework, because I would have always said that I was a strong individualist. And to me, it was setting up a society needed to solve the problem of putting everyone in a good position, but that the way to think about it is that each individual is valuable. And so that to me at the earlier time would have translated into, we can't have a society in which 10% of people are in dire straits at all times. And that kind of individualism made egoism very comfortable to me. And I had been reading about ideas and things a lot before that, and I always, well, so to take a step back before that, when I was about 16, I started watching The New Atheists on YouTube, because one of the big philosophical issues that got me into philosophy in the first place was God. And I watched, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett,
Right.
and read a lot of their books. And, they were struggling with a lot of different philosophical issues overlapping with the issue of morality and God. And that was the kind of set of things that I was thinking about. But I'd always been curious too about, anything that was kind of forbidden fruit. So at that point, I'd watched or read some interview with Anton LaVey, who started the Church of Satan. I was like, what are these people up to? And he's
watered down Pop Nietzsche was my.
Well, he actually he admitted to ripping off Ayn Rand, or attempting to do so. And, he said basically, he said, my view of Satanism is that it's the philosophy of Ayn Rand turned into a religion.
This podcast, we do not endorse this endorsement.
Yeah, and pretty satanic. But no, it was the idea. So the idea that the sort of kernel of egoism versus altruism as a debate in ideas, not a serious one, because even then I didn't take him and Satanism very seriously. He seemed like a cult of personality type of guy who just had some weird followers around him. But raising issues about egoism versus altruism, thinking, how does individualism fit into that? And so it was all very murky and not tied together. But
it sounds like one of the major things that you had going for you. So Ayn Rand has this argument or this view that when most people have the concept of morality, they don't even really have the concept of morality. Morality is a guide to the choices and actions and values that a human being should have. What they have is what she calls a frozen abstraction of all they have is altruism. All they have is the idea that morality is sacrificing yourself. And so it's not that when they hear the objectivist view, they don't go, oh, that's one view, and no, I have a different view. That's not morality. Like, it doesn't, they can't even get that there can be competing conceptions that one has to have reasons for. And it sounds like what you got from these earlier thinkers, and just your own thinking, was there's a question here of like, we have different options and which option makes the most sense. And so when you hear Ayn Rand's, it's much easier to take it in a way where if somebody just has their mind clogged with morality equals what we would call altruism, self-sacrifice, you can't go very far with that.
Yeah, and it was interesting too, the way that I think altruism and egoism is split across the culture in interesting ways, and that I don't think there was ever a time when I would have considered myself an altruist from the perspective of morality is about sacrificing, or sacrificing for others, giving the other person your favorite toy. Like that, I always would have rebelled against that. But to me, morality was more, are you going to be nice to people or cruel to people? Do you want people to suffer or to flourish? Do you, it was a sort of hedonistic and even utilitarian then in politics calculus of suffering versus, doing well. And
it sounds very similar to Sam Harris's view.
Yeah, and that's the kind of person I think on the left that is susceptible to better ideas. But I think it's also not clearly the case that people on the left are more altruistic than people on the right. I would have always associated the idea of self-sacrifice, giving away your favorite toy, being the example, with something that Christians would have told me to do. And that would have been one of my key reasons for being skeptical about religion. It's like, these people are bonkers. It doesn't make any sense. Why? Right? It's like Ayn Rand was able to one question that blows up that whole system's why.
Yeah. So, well, let's move on then, because, part of it was between the time you discovered Ayn Rand and the time we met, it had been 2 years. And like when I met you, I thought you must have been like me, where you'd been, even though you were young, you'd been studying it for a lot longer because you just knew so much and held it in such a very first-handed way. But one of the points you made was that you had really honed your understanding by, like, you spent a lot of time talking about these ideas with other really smart people who disagreed with them, that really helped shape your thinking. And then you had a lot of success, more than most of us, had at persuading people. So maybe kind of give us a bird's eye view of that. And then there's a lot I'd like to delve into about it.
Yeah. So when I discovered Ayn Rand, it was at the recommendation of a friend who asked me what I thought about altruism. That was the way he began that. He knew I was a philosophy student and he was a psychology student, and he felt there was a tension in the way they were using those words that he wanted to resolve. But he recommended I read Ayn Rand. I went and watched the Mike Wallace interview that day. That's when I was hooked. I ran and bought her books. And then I tore through those books over a summer and had read like everything, nonfiction first, including OPAR and ITOE. That's Objectivism, Philosophy of Ayn Rand, and Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. So all of that, I just tore through it, and it just felt like I had one block after another, like being fitted into place in my head. And I did that all alone, and I didn't really talk to anybody about it for a little while. And then I think I started talking to friends about it probably toward the end of that summer. But it wasn't very long that, and none of my friends were very into ideas in the way that I was at that time. So most of them came to adopt the ideas only because I was forcefully arguing for them, and they had a lot of strong views to the contrary. But where I really got some pushback was I studied abroad in the Netherlands and went to a small school that it was this like small like honors academy of the University of Utrecht, but in another city, with about 600 students, all focused on social sciences. Pretty much that was the emphasis there, and they
just
were
raised in an educated culture.
yeah, and it was an international school. It was like so it was taught in English. People were there from all over, mostly Europe, but it was. I mean, to say left leaning is like to understate it. They were all reading Foucault, like in every class, and it was in that environment where I was able to actually start an objectivist club before I left. I was only there for 4 months, and it was, and I was not to say like in the closet about it at the beginning, but I knew I wasn't in friendly territory, and I had the books with me and visible on my shelf, and people would start asking me like, hey, what and I would if a philosophical or political or whatever topic actually came up, I would give them my view of it. But when I started mentioning it's Ayn Rand and so on, most of them hadn't heard of her. But I gave a presentation at the philosophy club there that like split the club in half, basically. So we had a decent sized club, and then after that was able to start meeting with people who are interested in objectivism.
And so kind of how did those conversations work? So I mean, let me just start with a what I assume is a contrast, which is and maybe I'll give it what like maybe it was closer to what I was like in college. Hopefully I wasn't this bad, but I've definitely seen it with typical objectivist college students, which is like this is true, here's the argument, here's why you're wrong, God help you, here's why you're immoral, something like that. And so I'm curious as to getting into what how would those conversations go, and feel free if like you had an evolution in how you conducted them to talk about that, such that you ended up having a lot more success at first of all just getting a hearing from people, and I think in a way that most of us don't at that age, and then second of all having some sort of an impact.
Yeah, I think it would be very easy to get like wound around the axle on some particular topic. So I think most of those conversations started from the perspective that they grasped that I was coming from a viewpoint that that didn't fit into their categories. And so it was, can you kind of give me the gist of where you're coming from? And in that way you have a chance to kind of step back and say, here it is on one foot. And then they have questions because they're trying to poke holes, and you have good answers to all the questions. So it's sort of, once you're in their framing, it's very hard to like argue your way out of it. But if you can start by someone realizing that you have that you are sort of unexplored territory intellectually, and they just want to understand what you think, then you give them a little presentation of it, and they can sort of start trying to pick it apart. And then that's where you can handle those objections and so on in a way that you're having the conversation about that philosophy. And part of it was when you're trying to talk between contexts, it's impossible. So when you get them into, okay, now we're talking about objectivism, then they have questions, objections, arguments, responses, examples, whatever, and you can go from there. But a huge part of it too is when you're trying to give them an understanding of what it is, having a sense of what they're motivated by. Like, why are they interested in ideas at all? And what are they probably not fully satisfied with in the ideas they currently have? I like to present objectivism to someone who is on the left from the perspective that it's a system that doesn't actually embrace conflicts between men's interests. Like, we actually think that you can have the poor getting richer and the rich getting richer and everyone becoming better off, everyone happier, and there's nobody being sacrificed to anybody else. And when that's like a big promise, that's a headline statement, and then they say, tell me more. I don't believe you yet, or maybe, maybe something about it sounds right, but can you explain more about what you mean by that? And it's not, I'm telling you that you're wrong. It's, I'm telling you, hey, I discovered something and it resolves a real problem that almost everybody acknowledges.
I wonder how much, because I think you had two things working in your favor. I mean, just aside from your ability to think and articulate your ideas well, but I mean, just in terms of the context you're operating in. So one is, I think it's relevant. I mean, it might be relevant that, this is a largely European context where they weren't familiar with Ayn Rand, because part of the point you made is they can't block it into their existing categories. But I think part of what happens in America is that she does get put into conventional categories that, that's a conservative viewpoint with some, caveats or something, or it's the libertarian. It gets funneled into existing categories in a way that can be dismissed, of like, this is the inspiration for the Tea Party and Paul Ryan. Like, okay, I don't have to deal with that because I know that that's already wrong. Then the other thing is that you're dealing with people who are much more reflective than the typical person, which is not saying that it's easier to persuade them, because I think it can be both easier or harder depending on how you look at it. But what it does mean is that there's more likely to be motivations to examine their own ideas and other ideas, precisely because they're much more aware of any tensions in their ideas. Whereas the kind of person who's not very reflective about their political views, and it's much more affiliation, and it's not like a dominant thread in their life, is they're likely to be satisfied with whatever view they currently hold, precisely because they're not really trying to put all the pieces together and connect it to what's going on in the world. And how much do you think that was, an advantage that made those discussions much more profitable than they otherwise would have been?
Yeah, I think it's definitely kind of an alignment of the stars on many things. One being that I think people in Europe are more aware of what the philosophical issues are when they're not explicitly interested in philosophy. So I know the person who I was paired with as a roommate there, who ended up being one of my best friends, he told me that they discussed Kant basically in chemistry class in high school. So it's, you have people there whose I think awareness of philosophical issues and where intellectuals are more prominent in the culture, that back then, I think that's less the case now, because really there are these massive like rock star public intellectuals, in a way that seemed like there wasn't as much of that going on back then. But in France and in other places in Europe, the intellectuals were the Hollywood celebrities, and so ideas were at the forefront in a way that you didn't have to introduce people to the geography of philosophy. You could actually begin talking about ideas from a basic understanding of what the ideas were, which is a contrast to the friends that I had from high school, in the United States. And the other thing, I think, actually being in a position of being just simply mired in ideology, in postmodern and Marxist ideology that's so floating. None of it first-handed. It's all recitation of dogma, delivered, as though it's obvious by professors, with argument from intimidation, with a clear, it's a very unstable mixture in someone's head, and you can pick it apart, and so it's not that they have a firmly held and well-grounded worldview that is backed up by lots of experience and concretes and so on, and then you have to come in and try to write over this unwritable disc. It was, their head is full of junk, and it's a relief when they see someone starting to make sense and putting ideas on the table in an integrated way that actually solves rather than creating more problems.
One thing, I'm pretty sure I had a small child run in here a little while ago and make some noise, and people are doing yard work outside my window. So as I've stressed again and again in this podcast, we are very low tech, real people, not professionals here. But one factor that we kind of glossed over, but I think is really important and very related to this is, so we kind of jumped from your early political thinking, which was grounded in morality, to Ayn Rand. But you mentioned offhandedly, you had been majoring in philosophy before you even discovered Ayn Rand, and so you had an awareness and an understanding of other frameworks that people were using to think about things. And one of the things, this has come up with a number of the other guests, but just the more you're aware of other frameworks, first of all, the clearer you are in yours, because you understand what is this in contrast to, what is Ayn Rand distinguishing her view from, and how does it relate to these other views. But it's super helpful when it comes to persuasion, right? Because you can kind of you have the map of how somebody else is processing reality, and then if the more sophisticated you become, the more you have a map of how they'll process your attempt to give them your framework.
Yeah, and it's a huge, communication is a massive part of it. If you have no idea how to begin from someone else's context, you don't know how to motivate a certain line of thought you want them to have, you don't know how to put something in words that mean more to them than other words. Some of it comes naturally to people. They figure out a lot of what you would find, and you think about the best book conceivable on communication, what kinds of things it would say. Many people find in different circumstances natural ways of figuring a lot of those things out, whether it's in dating or in a job interview or whatever. Some people are kind of natural at it, and I think I was able to do that with philosophical ideas. I used to spend 8 hours in a coffee shop with friends in high school and in college talking about ideas, and it was there that you try things out on people, you see how they receive them, you see an approach to disagreement, you see an approach to building, to finding an area, to building on an agreement, and how do you have the parry and thrust of ideas. And most people who really have devoted a lot of their lives and their time to trying to influence people would do really well to do it one-on-one, because what you learn one-on-one is something you're going to be able to apply when you are amplified by media. And this is where my marketing background, or I guess foreground, because it's that far after, but comes in too. It's the best marketers understand that good marketing is just salesmanship in print. It's face-to-face selling translated into media. This
is so important, and I don't think it's discussed enough. So I've spent a lot of time, well, let me put it this way. So in my work with Alex Epstein, one of the major things we do is we create messaging for whether it's politicians, businesses, for them to use to help them achieve their persuasion goals. So long as we agree with the goals, as long as they're pushing for, free policies, not free handouts. But the one of the things that will often be said is, oh, we want to see data that this works. And what you see is that in the messaging world, the way that they kind of prove how effective they are is you have these, like polls. And what they'll do is you have a polling group that will come out and test, say, would you be more likely to vote for a candidate who said XYZ phrase or for, this other phrase? Would you like fracking under it's they have these kind of very one-off, out of context questions, and they think, all right, well, this gives us measurable data, so we can know it's persuasive. We know that this polls 10% better, and it's these very small margins, right? And so they think, okay, this is how we're going to get the most persuasive messaging, is we're going to have these kind of like polling. We're going to do these, these, what's the word I'm looking for? They'll get together a group to kind of discuss, run different messages by. And if we're talking though about actually transformative persuasion, not like eking out 2 or 3 more % popularity amongst people, the only way that gets discovered is by persuasive individuals one-on-one testing out a lot of things, because there's so much complexity and variables involved in effective persuasion. Persuasion doesn't occur with even like one paragraph, let alone like, here's your one motto or whatever. It occurs over time and in a very complex, rich back and forth. And it's only once you've tested out different approaches that you can then synthesize it into something that is, condensed, shareable, and whatnot. But you'll never arrive at what's genuinely persuasive by if you start with just, this is something I could test in a lab or with a poll.
And one problem there too is that people are in a completely different mode when they're telling you they're persuaded versus acting as if they're persuaded. So, for example, probably one of the best copywriters in the history of the world was Gary Halbert. And if he finished a sales letter, he would take it, to the local bar and show it to somebody. And if they said, this is great, then he knew it was garbage. If they said, where can I buy the thing?
Mm-hmm.
Then it worked. Because people are not standing where they're standing when they're telling you whether what you're saying is persuasive. They're now standing where you are, judging as an ally of yours whether what you're saying is persuasive, and it's not the same thing. So it's what people will tell you. It's good to talk to the relevant market, but get them to say, can I buy? Don't get them to say this is a good ad.
Yeah, that's a really good piece of advice, just generally, if you want to be good at persuasion. So one of my experiences that really cemented just this point was I had written a fundraising letter for the Ayn Rand Institute years ago that ended up raising, I think, $70,000 or something. It was pretty successful, and it's the first one I ever wrote. But I got feedback from some people who would say, "Oh, this was too long." And the question was, all right, were you going to donate $10,000 and you didn't because it was too long? And yeah, it's too long if you're not the target. But if somebody's thinking about writing a big check, they want a lot of details. They need a lot of reassurance. They want a lot of questions answered. And so set aside whether you're writing fundraising letters, the point is that you need to be very careful how you're testing your material and how you're evaluating whether it works, because you can get very misleading feedback for exactly the kind of reason you're mentioning.
Yeah, it's a real problem. I think market research and testing and that sort of thing generally is so hard to actually map in a way that's useful that most of it is more harm than good. And the long copy, short copy debate is a really good example of, we have reasons for thinking something is too long. The principle we're going to apply here is shortened attention spans.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the relevant principle. Like you said, if somebody is, you want to design the thing for the person who's actually the qualified prospect. So the person who is thinking about buying wants more information, not less. Someone who will be bored after 20 seconds was not a qualified prospect. And no letter is going to be able, no short letter is going to be able to do the sales job either. The long letter won't do it for him, and neither will the short one. However, the person who is thinking about sending you a $10,000 check might not if you don't have enough information there. And if you have all the information he wants, there's a whole spectrum of people who want to skim. Some people will write you a $10,000 check after they skimmed just the subheadings in your letter and then the call to action at the end. So what's this paying for? Okay, they'll do that. But there's also the guy who's going to read every single word 5 times before sending you a check. And you need to capture both of those people. And the way to capture both of those people is to have that second readership path. So you have a skimmer-friendly long letter that has lots of information. And those kinds of things you figure out. You never understand all of the causality of something like that, but you try one, you try the other, and then you see which one makes more money.
Well, and I just want to connect this to the point we were making before, because what I don't want people to think is, oh man, now I have to go out and run some A/B test with my material. That's not the takeaway. I think the takeaway for most people trying to communicate pro-freedom ideas is, if you actually sit down and engage in back and forth with people and you see what works and what doesn't, you start to develop not an infallible, but a very strong antenna, so that when you're trying to do more formal kinds of communication, you're much more sensitive to how this will be processed by the people you're trying to reach than you will if you're just not exposed to the other side at all, but B, versus even taking advice from somebody you think is a good editor, or just a sympathetic friend. You want kind of in the trenches real feedback of, oh, they got excited and asked for more information, or I actually changed their mind, versus just somebody patting you in the back and going, that was a really well done piece.
Well, and there's an interesting kind of philosophical tie-in here, which is, if you really appreciate the fact that there is no collective, there are only individuals, then there's a certain way in which persuasion being scaled is scaled in the scope of the medium being used, but it's not being scaled from the individual to the collective. And many people speak as though they're speaking to a collective, and when they're trying to persuade a bunch of individuals. And so when you're trying to persuade a lot of people, you should speak to them as though you're speaking to one person. And you should find the least common denominator among them, and so on, and do that. And also think about it in terms of an audience of slivers of different interests and affinities and so on, and then you've got to tick the box for each one somewhere in your presentation. But scale is important in thinking about this. It's the right scale is the individual. And if you have a lot of experience persuading individuals, you can see it. And there are parallels in stand-up comedy. When you see the 1 hour comedy special that somebody does, he wrote that material across a period of possibly years, trying it out in small comedy clubs with small variations and seeing an immediate response on the faces of people. And that's how someone turns into a world-class comedian. He didn't go into a cabin in the woods and write all of that.
Yeah, and I mean, comedians are big on, there is no substitute for the stage.
Yeah.
You do not know it's funny until it's been put to the test. Yeah. And you do not know it's persuasive until it's put to the test. And that's why you want to run the test with as much feedback as possible. And there's no better way than these one-on-one or 1-on-2 or 1-on-3 conversations.
And you don't need to, the thing is about that is that that reduces the complexity of the problem, because you don't need to understand the causality. a comedian doesn't need to back engineer why everything he said was funny. He just needs evidence that it is, and to proceed from that evidence. So the more you can, not have to understand the mechanics, that's what testing should be for. And so testing shouldn't be used to try to validate chunks of the mechanics that then are applied in every context. It's very complicated, and you have so many overlapping variables. You try things and you see what works. And you only do that in hand-to-hand combat, I think.
Well, I mean, we could have a whole conversation about that, because
Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely a role for extracting as much causality as you can, but there's a big danger there.
And overfitting it to other situations.
Yeah, and I think the causality is valuable, but the real cash value, what I am trying to stress here is that you develop a sensitivity that like for instance, when I'm writing now, I can just like feel like, no, that way, if I put it that way, and I could stop and work out in a very detailed way for some of it, why that wouldn't work or why it wouldn't. And when I edit other people and have to explain to them why not to do it, that can sometimes be a struggle, because when somebody's committed to like writing something a certain way and I'm telling them this won't work, and yet I can't fully parse out why it is, but this is a radar I've developed over more than 20 years and of getting exactly that kind of feedback. And but it can be very hard to put into words. And so, well, Adam, this is really interesting, and I hope to drag you back on, hopefully not kicking and screaming at some point.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thank you.